We'd like to thank those who have sponsored this week's drasha, Rochelle Diamond and the Diamond, Ginsburg, and Newman families to commemorate the yahrzeit of their bubby and great-grandmother, Chaya Sarah Tarshish, Zichronah Livracha, Neshama She'ev and Aliyah, Bev Morris, in memory of her beloved father, Jack M. Morris, Yitzchak Ben Shaya V'Malka, Zichronah Livracha, his yahrzeit being the 16th of Mar Cheshvan, his Neshama She'ev and Aliyah, Dolores and Len Schwartz and Melanie and Sandy Carlin to commemorate the 36th yahrzeit of their father and grandfather, Martin Choina, Mordechai Menachem Ben Yisrael Yaakov Zichronah Livracha, his Neshama She'ev and Aliyah. Thank you all very much. We continue reading in this week's parsha of the journeys of Avram Avinu. And for at least part of the journeys of Avram Avinu, there's a very important figure, a very relevant figure who comes along with him on at least some of the journeys, and that is Lot. Lot, his nephew. Later in this week's parsha, Avram risks his life to save Lot from a great war. But at the beginning of this week's parsha, in Avram's grand journey to go to the holy land that God will show him, Lot comes along with him. And what I'd like to focus on for a few minutes now is seemingly a very minor grammatic point, but there's a very interesting pshat that comes out of it. In the beginning of this week's parsha, in the 4th pasuk, it says, Vayelech Avram, and Avram went, Kasher diber elav Hashem, like God told him, Vayelech ito Lot. And Lot went along with him. Okay, that's the beginning of the parsha. So they go down to the land of Canaan, of Israel, and then, of course, we know the story. They go to the land of Israel, and they find a terrible famine there. And then they go to the land of Egypt, and then there's this very unfortunate circumstance, very challenging circumstance, frightening, that Paro takes Sarai. He wants her as a wife, and to make a long story short, it turns out that God punishes Paro, and then Paro, returns Sarai back to her home and actually leaves the family with great gifts. So now it's time for Avram, Sarai to leave Egypt and to go back to the land of Israel. And it says in the pasuk, Vayal Avram Mitzrayim, at the beginning of Perek Yud Gimel, Vayal Avram Mitzrayim, Avram went up from Egypt, who? V'ishto v'chol asher lo, he and his wife and all that were with him, V'lot imo, and Lot with him. So at the beginning of the parsha, when Avram is going to the land of Israel, it says, Vayelech ito, when it refers to Lot going with Avram. And then when Lot is returning to the land of Israel from the land of Egypt, it's V'lot imo. Both words are basically translated as meaning with him. But is there a significant difference between ito and imo? An interesting thing to think about. And the Meshech Chochmah has a very novel approach. The basic premise is something that many Mefarshim say in general about the difference between ito and imo. We use the term, even in English, I'm with you. What do we mean when we say we're with you? It could be, I'm standing with you. If you look to your right, I happen to be standing there. I'm with you. I'm sitting in the car next to you. Whatever it is. Sometimes someone will say, I'm with you. And it means much more than physical positioning. It means I'm connected to you. I'm on the same page as you. I relate to things in the same way as you relate to them. So according to many commentators, ito connotes that it's two people really on the same page, really of one worldview, of one motivation. And imo connotes he was physically with him. So the Meshech Chochmah suggests as follows. And after everything we end up hearing about Abraham and Lot throughout the story of their lives, the Meshech Chochmah is really shocking. The Meshech Chochmah says, that when Avram and Sarai went on the journey from God, Lot was ito. Lot was with him. They were on the same page. Lot wasn't just a tag-along. And whatever Avram's broader motivations were for why to go on this journey, Lot was his partner in that. I don't know that the Meshech Chochmah means that they were 100% partners. Maybe Lot is the junior partner. But he was with the program. He was very much with the program. And then they get to the land of Israel. And we have, I think it's Pasuk Zion, in Perek Yud Beis, Pasuk Zion. Hashem appears to Avram. And that's a whole new level of revelation that Avram hadn't had before. And Avram is in the Holy Land of Israel. And Avram grows. Avram, after not only extending himself to go on this journey to Israel, but now having the merit through his extending himself of God speaking to him, Avram is gradually becoming a different person. So much so that after they first come to Israel, they go to the land of Egypt, and then they have an experience in Egypt, and now it's time to go back to the land of Israel. And there, points out the Meshech Chochmah, Lot is no longer ito. He's no longer ito. Now he's just imo. He's physically with him. And it's very nice that he's coming along with Avram. That's great. But Avram has transformed. Avram has become a different person. Lot doesn't relate to things anymore in the same way that Avram does. Avram is a person who God appears to him, however you even understand that phrase, for God to appear to someone. So Lot no longer is ito. Lot is only imo, physically with him. Then there's one more pasuk that the Meshech Chochmah cites. A little bit further in Perek Yud Gimel, we have the famous story of the shepherds of Lot having a run-in with the shepherds of Avram. And it gets to the point where Avram finally says to Lot, we shouldn't be living like this, let's split up. And the introductory pasuk to this story says, V'gam lelot ha'oleches Avram. And also Lot, who traveled with Avram, he also had various livestock. Now, wait a second. This is the third time we have it. The first time it said Lot was ito, completely with Avram. The second time it says Lot was imo. When they're returning to Israel, it says Lot was imo. He's physically with him. The third time it says Lot was holech es Avram, which is the equivalent of saying ito. So what does it mean that Lot is back to being on the same page as Avram? And the Meshech Chochmah says a fascinating thing. The Meshech Chochmah says, no, Lot was not on the same page as Avram. But this pasuk is from the vantage point of Lot. And Lot looked at Avram, and Lot thought to himself, yeah, we're on the same page. And Lot completely missed the boat. They're different people now. And of course, the greatest proof that they're different people is what happens in a little bit. Avram says to Lot, listen, this whole thing with our shepherds and the arguments and the grazing of the land, it's not working. By the way, we're taught in the Medrash that Lot's shepherds were allowing their animals to graze on other people's properties. And Avram's shepherds weren't all right with that. So Avram says we have to split up. You have to split up. Avram is going to be one of the most important people in world history. Lot shrugs his shoulders. He says, okay, no problem. And that's understandable because from Lot's vantage point, Avram's a good person. He's a good person. They went on the journey. They've had the same experiences. They're both great people. But the proof is in the pudding. What did Lot ultimately decide? Lot ultimately decided to go live in the land of stone. Why did he want to live in the land of stone? The simple understanding is he thought it would be excellent for his financial well-being. The land was good. It's a very interesting point that Rashi brings down. Rashi says he knew that the people of stone had issues with sexual immorality. And actually, there's a Sifsei Chachamim that connects that to a Rashi about the people of Egypt that also had issues with sexual immorality, as we know from Avram and Sarah's journey there. And the Sifsei Chachamim suggests that Lot became so interested in the opportunity for inappropriate sexual activity based on what he saw in Egypt. So he might have had the same itinerary as Avram did, but he viewed things from a very different prism. And tragically, at the beginning of their journey, they didn't view things from such a different prism. But at some point, Lot became different. And Lot was fine with splitting with Avram because we're on the same page. We're similar people. But the greatest proof that they were anything but was where Lot ended up going. It's a very interesting shot, just the nuance and different words in the psukim as we flow through the parsha. But I want to just reflect on a few, I think, significant life lessons about relationships. One is maybe not about relationships, but about our own journeys. We can and should be people of growth. There's no need to say to ourselves, if I used to be X, then that's what I'm going to be all of my life. I'm not talking about beating up on ourselves, but complacent. This is what I am. Look, I've never been the type to go to 15 shiurs during the week. I've never been the type to be a big chesed machine. It's just not me. I've never been the type to daven at shul all the time. Avram had a transformational experience. Now, Avram was a great, great giant. But you know what? What we're learning in this parsha is Avram at the beginning of the parsha, he didn't remain, as the parsha continued, he didn't remain the same person he was at the beginning of the parsha. And certainly the person he was at the beginning of the parsha was tremendous. One thing to think about. Another thing to think about. There are people in this world who grow. What about the people in relationships with them? It could be a friend. It could be a close relative. It could be a spouse. It could be a child. It could be a parent. How do we view that? Many, many times, we're somewhat uncomfortable about it. Bothers us a little bit. It's understandable why. First of all, things change. Maybe some of the jokes we used to say, some of the activities we used to do aren't as relevant anymore. It also presumably makes us feel a bit insecure. But could you imagine how different of a person Lot would have ended up? And the next part of the story, fast forwarding, Lot has this bizarre thing that he ends up having sexual relations with both of his daughters. Bizarre. Lot has a situation where he wants to sacrifice his daughters to be raped by the people of stone because he needs to protect his guests all over the place. Could you imagine how different of a person Lot would have been if Lot looked deeper and saw how great Avram was and saw how Avram had continued to grow and said to himself, if there's one thing I need to do in this world, it's to connect in a meaningful way to this uncle of mine and never let go and learn from him. Could you imagine how different of a person Lot would have turned out to be? It's interesting. It's just interesting to think about. There are people around us who grow. Do we ever, and some of us do we ever stop and say, if they can do it, I can too? Or maybe not even that. Maybe just say, share with me a little bit of what's so meaningful to you. Let me learn a little bit from you. Let me be inspired a little bit by you. One more postscript, by the way. Despite the fact that Lot clearly was ready to go his own path and got himself into a terrible mess in this parsha. He ends up going to the land of Stone, ill-advised, ends up going to the land of Stone, and he becomes a captive in a war. Avram risks his life to save him, which means that to Avram, mishpacha is mishpacha. Family is family. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that on some level he was rejected by his nephew. He's always there for him. Also just something to think about. Obviously, our lives are so different than these people from the Chumash. But I think if we listen close enough, we can pick up some meaningful echoes that are relevant in our lives as well. Thank you for listening. Have a wonderful Shabbos. Take care.